Sports Medicine. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Season 3 of Sports Medicine Special Edition. I'm your host, Carlos de Los Angeles, NASM CPT, CES, CNC, BCS, weight loss specialist, and of course, Fit certified practitioner. And today, I got a very special guest. He is one of the main NASM contributors to our textbooks and materials. Oh my goodness. And definitely an expert on the field. He is professor of exercise physiology at San Diego State University and NASM master instructor. Fabio Comana, welcome.
Thank you, Carlos. I feel like I'm about to enter the boxing ring.
You sure are. You're a heavyweight champion. Definitely
are. Hey, I won't take the heavyweight, but it's been COVID, so maybe I'll take a few more pounds. Okay.
Oh, I don't care what weight it is. You're a champion. That's the point.
Thank you. Very kind.
Okay. Thank you. And we appreciate you taking from your busy time to be with us here today.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay. So we're going to be talking about bioenergetics, energy systems, however you want to call it, and exercise physiology, of course. And Master, one thing that I want to make clear to our clients and our fellow health and fitness professionals, right off the bat, what are the energy systems in our body? Aerobic system, anaerobic system, and how long does each system last when we're exercising?
Sure. So if we kind of take a high-level overview, basically the aerobic system, by definition, involves the presence of oxygen. If we look at some of the key features of that energy system, it would be an energy system that will sustain us for long periods of time. So indefinitely, really, as long as there's fuel in the body. It can use all three macronutrients. So essentially, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins can all feed into the aerobic pathway. And while it's a sustainable energy system, one of the downsides of that energy system is that it produces energy relatively slowly. When I say relatively, relative to the anaerobic pathways. Now, the anaerobic pathways, by comparison, are systems that are very limited. In other words, they can only produce energy for a short amount of time. I'll get to that answer very shortly. They only use carbohydrates as a fuel. So within the anaerobic, we can actually further subdivide it into what we call the phosphagen system, which is made up primarily of molecules of ATP. There's a small amount that exists in your body at any given time. It might be around 3 ounces, right? And the larger component of this first anaerobic system, which is called phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate. And then, of course, the major anaerobic system that most of us talk about, Carlos, is what they call the glycolytic or the lactate system, or sometimes it's called the fast glycolytic. It goes by many names. And this is the one that we always talk about that is involved with the production of lactate. Okay. And this one can last a lot longer than the phosphagen system, but it only uses glucose as a fuel. So there is no fats, no proteins directly into the anaerobic pathways. Now you ask the question, how long do they last? Well, it really depends on what you're doing and when you're using them. So let me address how long they last. So if you were to do an all-out sprint, in other words, you're giving me the best performance you could give me, not to confuse that with effort. Remember, effort and performance are very different. Okay. Right? Effort is purely subjective. Performance is objectively measured. So if you're giving me your best performance, fresh set of legs, I say, Carlos, go sprint for me. You're giving me your best sprint. The phosphagen system, a good estimate would be around 10 seconds. Maybe not as long as 10 seconds, but a world-class athlete, maybe a little over 10 seconds. Now, by comparison, the second anaerobic system, the fast glycolytic or the lactate, whatever you want to call it, we say on average for the average adult, it's about 2 minutes for a female and maybe up to about 3 minutes for a male. Now, if you're conditioned, it might go a little longer. So let's call it 3 minutes for a female and say up to 4 minutes for a male.
Okay, that will be a high caliber athlete, right?
Yes. And now, by comparison, the aerobic system could last you indefinitely. I mean, we talk about these ultra marathoners and the Ironman. I mean, it can go on for hours and hours as long as you have fuel. The aerobic systems will fuel you. But of course, the downside is the intensity is much lower because it produces energy less efficiently and more slowly.
Okay. Perfect. And so that's kind of like the threshold for the ATP, back to the ATP PC system. Because I've read in some places it can last as long as 15 seconds, maybe. That's not true. It's just 10 seconds, actually.
Well, as I said, it depends. If you were walking and that was the only energy system you had, it might be good for about 60 seconds. So it really depends on the intensity, and it's got to do with the rate at which it produces energy. Because when you do intense exercise, your demand for energy is very high, say per second. And so you need an energy system that can deliver large amounts of energy per second. And that's the phosphagen system. So we generally say it's about 10 seconds, but you're right. It could be 15 seconds because a person may not be giving their 100%. They might be at 90% or 95%. So certainly it might be able to go 15 seconds. But if you were walking and that was the only energy system you had, it might be good for about a minute. That's about it. It's just designed to get you going.
Okay.
Now, I just want to add one thing, if I could, very quickly to this.
Sure.
A common mistake made by a lot of fitness professionals is they believe that these anaerobic systems only contribute during high intensity exercise.
Okay.
And that, in fact, is very, very incorrect. It's got to do with change of intensity. So let's say you're sitting here right now in your chair, right? And right now, it's a pretty safe assumption to say that most of your energy is coming from the aerobic pathway.
Sure.
You don't have much energy. You might be burning, 2.5 calories a minute if you're moving around in your chair. But if I suddenly said, hey, Carlos, here's what I want you to do. I want you to stand and sit 10 times. Just do that. It may take you 20 seconds to do it. Now, if I was to ask you, how hard was that? I'm sure you'd tell me, that was a 1 out of 10. It was real easy.
Mm-hmm.
But if we were to evaluate what energy system fueled all of that, it was the phosphagen system.
Wow.
Because you're always changing intensity in life. And anytime you change, unlike a light switch where it's just instantaneous, the energy systems, the aerobic one, take a while to adapt. So when you do any change of intensity, you immediately rely on the anaerobic systems, with the phosphagen being the first one.
Okay, and is it true? Let's just clarify. There's a lot of people make this mistake, assuming that maybe we utilize a certain energy system exclusively during certain activities.
That is incorrect. Think of it as a continuum where they're all being used almost simultaneously. It's just a continuum that shifts according to the intensity and the duration. So, for example, if you're, let's say you decide to go for a walk and you're standing at a traffic light, and at that particular moment, it's probably a good assumption that most of the energy is coming from the aerobic system. Then all of a sudden the light changes green, but it only changes green for 5 seconds. So you want to jog across the street.
Okay.
In that instant, you probably switched over predominantly to the phosphagen system.
Wow.
Because it was your most immediate. Then you get across the street and then you kind of break it back down to a walk. So now the phosphagen system shuts back down and the aerobic system takes over the main rein. So it's a continuum where these systems are working in some sort of synchronized fashion. But you're right, it'll probably never be a point where only one is working exclusively.
Excellent. Okay, now another misconception. Let's dig into the difference between the lactate threshold and the anaerobic threshold. That also creates a lot of confusion.
Oh yeah.
A lot of people think it's the exact same thing. Let me hear.
So there's been a error that occurred at some point in time, because what research calls lactate threshold and what practitioners call lactate threshold are not the same. So by definition, the lactate threshold is the very first appearance of significant levels of lactate appearing in your blood. We generally say a level of 2 millimoles per liter.
Okay.
So you have lactate in your blood right now, but a very small amount.
Okay.
Now, if you start exercising, as exercise gets harder and harder and you rely more on the carbohydrates as a fuel and more on the anaerobic systems, you start spilling over lactate into the blood more rapidly. And eventually we get to a point where we see a first deflection of your blood lactate levels going above 2 millimoles.
Okay.
And that's by definition in science called your lactate threshold. Now, how hard is that? Carlos, it's probably only like a 5.5 to 7 out of 10 effort. So it's not that hard. It happens in moderate to maybe slightly hard exercises.
Sub-maximal intensity?
Yes, absolutely.
We tend to think it's max intensity. It's not.
Now, that's where your anaerobic threshold comes in. So the word that most of us have associated with lactate threshold is actually what we call our anaerobic threshold. That's one of the names it goes by. It also goes by other names: respiratory compensation point, OBLA, which is the onset of blood lactate accumulation. It goes by different names. And that's really where you're now overwhelming your blood's capacity to buffer lactate. And so that's where we'll see kind of another exponential jump in your blood lactate levels. Generally, we say you're now exceeding 4 millimoles per liter. Now,
Okay.
that's what we all associate, because at that lactate threshold, when you push over it, you're shutting down. But if you stay right underneath it, that's your highest sustainable intensity of exercise. So that is a
Great.
quintessential marker of performance, right?
Excellent.
So because of all this confusion, they call it aerobic threshold, lactate threshold, OBLA, respiratory compensation point. I've tended to, and not just me, a lot of scientists now use two different terms. They use ventilatory threshold 1, or VT1.
Okay.
And ventilatory threshold 2, which is VT2. Now you'll see more of that in the new CPT-7 that comes out, because
Awesome.
I contributed in writing that chapter on cardiorespiratory fitness and assessments, on those two chapters. And we start talking quite extensively about VT1 and VT2.
And which one each is each?
VT1 is that first one, lactate threshold.
Lactate, okay.
Which is probably, let's say, a 5.5 to maybe 7 at most out of 10 intensity.
Intensity, okay.
Whereas VT2, your anaerobic threshold, it's going to be that some 8.5, 9, 9.5 out of 10 intensity.
And now one question, when we do reach that anaerobic threshold, is that when we get this positive failure, when we cannot make any more repetitions on the positive?
Yes, the mind is willing, but the body's not able. It's because the hydrogen ions that are ordinarily spilled over into the blood are no longer being accepted by the blood, because the blood cannot accept them, because you've extinguished or depleted the lactate buffer, which is really a hydrogen buffer is what it is. So the muscle cells now have to accumulate it, and it starts to overwhelm the muscle cells, and that changes the pH within the muscle cells, and it interferes with the whole glycolytic pathway. So you start getting that tingling sensation because you start activating pain receptors. It's not painful, it's just a gradual shutting down, and there's only one solution. You need time to recover. That's all you need. And everything will regenerate itself, and then you can repeat the interval.
Excellent. Wow. Fantastic. Okay. Now digging a little bit into the hormones, more into the more physiology. The name of the hormones, the main hormones we release during exercise, responsible for focus, the adrenaline rush, and being, quote unquote, in the zone for athletes.
So there's a bigger part to this. So let me just start with a big part, that when we exercise, obviously exercise is a stress response.
Okay.
And so we actually release a lot of different hormones. So there's hormones that are intended to help mobilize fuel, preserve body water. So like we have glucagon mobilizing the glycogen stores. We have antidiuretic hormone to try and help preserve water, aldosterone to try and help preserve sodium. Those are not the ones I think you're talking about, because you mentioned specifically the focus, the adrenaline rush.
Yep.
So if we look at that, we can look at quintessential hormones, and we can also look at some neurotransmitters. So we can look at cortisol, which is a classic stress hormone. We can look at what a lot of people call adrenaline. Now, adrenaline is just it's a common word used in vernacular, but it's not really reflective of a hormone in our body, because adrenaline is really the hormone epinephrine.
Okay.
Now, in the United Kingdom, in the Commonwealth, they use the word adrenaline. We just call it epinephrine here in the US, right? And then it has its baby brother, what I call the baby brother, because it's a slightly weaker hormone. It's called norepinephrine, or sometimes called noradrenaline. So
I was going to ask about that, the norepinephrine. So what's actually the difference between these two?
Well, norepinephrine is interesting. It's both a neurotransmitter, but it's also a hormone. And the best way to explain its role as a hormone is that it's the baby brother to epinephrine. So when the stress is mild, so think of a moderate intensity workout.
Okay.
You might see more norepinephrine than you'd see epinephrine.
Interesting.
But when exercise becomes very stressful, or any stress response where we activate that fight or flight, then you get larger quantities of epinephrine, because it's just a more powerful hormone. So they work in a combination. It's just that epinephrine has very significant effects on the body, and a lot of times we don't need that much. So we have the baby brother that comes out.
That's good.
Now, what also happens under a stress response, this is more of a mindset, but researchers, Walter Cannon was one of the first. He called this a excite and delight response. So we're all familiar with fight and fright, or fight and flight, right? But there's other ones. There are other responses that researchers have discovered, like tend and befriend. And the one that we're talking about here is excite and delight, because what we see during a stress response is also with elevated levels of endorphins. We see elevated levels of dopamine. And if you think about what these things do, so endorphins being a hormone, dopamine being a neurotransmitter, number one, they can increased sense of pleasure and arousal. They can also mitigate pain, like endorphins can help suppress pain, right? And excuse me, but it can also create that positive mood experience, that euphoric state that we talk about. So the elevation of certain compounds in the brain can make us more laser focused. And that's why we see some people in the presence of stress freeze while other ones are they're doing these amazing things because it's a mindset, right?
Okay.
And it's an author called Kelly McGonigal. She's from Stanford. She writes a book called The Upside of Stress. And she goes into great detail. So if your listeners are very interested in learning more about the stress response, she does a good job breaking down the fight or flight response, the tendon befriend, which is related to the hormone oxytocin, which explains why females have generally a slightly different stress response than males. Right? I'm not just talking about exercise, stress in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Walter Cannon's Excite and Delight. And she kind of breaks them down nicely, and she gives you an understanding of how to do what. You can actually train yourself to have more of that Excite and Delight response so that you can see that stress can be beneficial to you rather than harmful. Because at the end of the day, stress is just a response, but it has helped you and I and all humans survive. So stress is really a good thing, maybe in moderation. So that's really what we're experiencing in this kind of euphoric state, is we're getting those releases of things like endorphins and neurotransmitters like dopamine, and you can actually train yourself to get a better response from that, which could actually get you a better high if you want to.
And is it true that the higher intensity training is that when we get most release of these hormones?
Technically, yes, because again, this release is also related back to cortisol and epinephrine.
Okay.
And those hormones are released in almost in relation to the magnitude of the stress. So the more stress you have, the more of those hormones you'll see. So there is kind of a bit of a correlation there.
Excellent. Wow. Okay. Now, it goes right with what we were talking about, the cortisol. For people to understand, is cortisol bad? We tend to think it's bad. It's like a villain all the time.
Yes, and unfortunately, I feel bad for cortisol because it gets the bad rap all the time. But actually, cortisol is a very noble hormone. I'll give you an example of where it's noble, where some of its noble roles lie. Number one, when you exercise, when you start exercising, you release a lot of hormones, like I mentioned, epinephrine, norepinephrine, glucagon. They all break down stored glucose and may make it available to muscle cells, but they also dump it from the liver into the blood, what glucagon does.
To be used for fuel, for energy.
To be used for fuel, yes. But here's a catch. You can never afford to run out of glucose, because if you run out of glucose in your blood, if that was to ever happen, which probably wouldn't happen, you'd die.
Yeah.
Because your red blood cells that carry oxygen can only feed off of glucose. So muscle cells will draw up a lot of glucose into the cells from the blood, which could put you at risk. So that's where cortisol is noble. Cortisol has a job, and one of its major jobs is to try and preserve blood sugar.
Okay.
So during a stress response where your muscle cells are gobbling up glucose, pulling them out of the blood and into the muscle cells, cortisol is actually working to try and control
and regulate that.
Regulate it and prevent it from actually depleting. So that's why cortisol can do other things. We talk about how cortisol can help. Some people say, well, it's good, it helps you burn more fats. True. But it can also do what? Attack your muscle protein. These are all things in its attempt to try and preserve blood sugar. Another very important role of cortisol is in the immune response. So let's say you cut yourself or you hurt yourself. Let's just use a cut as an example. We all get what we call an acute inflammatory response, right? Now, everybody gets scared by the word inflammation. Inflammation seems to be like one of those words where like, oh, inflammation is related to mortality and morbidity, but not necessarily. Acute inflammation is a very normal process that helps us heal, right? Helps us recover. It keeps us alive. And so when your immune system gets turned on, because we determined that there needs to be an immune response, after maybe, could be 24 hours, 48 hours, cortisol actually helps turn off your immune response, because your immune response is very taxing, but can also be damaging. We hear about autoimmune conditions, right?
Okay.
Cortisol is a very important hormone to actually shut down that acute inflammatory response. So it's normal to have it turn on, but cortisol plays a very important role in turning it back off. So cortisol is actually a very important hormone. And because it always gets released under stress, and we talk about how stress is bad for us, which it doesn't have to be, it always gets the bad rap. But cortisol let's just put it this way. In moderation and in normal dosages, cortisol is a very good hormone. Where cortisol becomes detrimental to health is that when stress remains elevated in your body.
Chronic stress.
That's exactly what I was going to get to. Yes. The chronic stress and cortisol response, that is detrimental. But the acute cortisol, just in general as a hormone, is actually a very beneficial and it's an essential hormone to allow us to survive.
Sure. And back to the focus, I mean, and alertness, we need that also. I mean, if you don't have any of that,
yes.
Yeah. Even in training itself, you need to be paying attention. You got a couple of hundred dumbbells over your head and you don't have adrenaline, you're not going to focus the same way. So yeah, definitely needed. All right. Very, very good. I actually heard you say like cortisol, actually a little bit of cortisol every day. It's actually beneficial because our body is designed to deal with that. And you know, back to the homeostasis, and we need like kind of like a balance of everything. Like nothing is like straight line perfect.
If there was, you know, when I'm talking to my students, I talk about, you know, this hormonal matrix, because there is kind of an idea that hormones can, you know, there's kind of a related response that hormones all have kind of a domino effect where one affects another. But if you can help control or stabilize the undulations or the fluctuations of two critical hormones, insulin and cortisol, you generally find over time that all the other hormones tend to fall in place. So those are two, you know, the two primary hormones that we have great opportunity in being able to regulate. We can control insulin through a lot of our dietary practices, as you know, and we can control cortisol by how we perceive and manage, you know, stress. And if you can get just healthy undulations of those two hormones, it can do wonders to improving your overall wellness.
Awesome. Yeah, and back to the with the cortisol, what you mentioned with the how is it like the too much cortisol is too bad, but if you maintain like a certain amount every day,
just undulated,
it's undulation, not so much testosterone. So cortisol and insulin are more responsible for this homeostasis more than the other hormones that we always think about testosterone.
Well, remember, homeostasis is a state that the body is always striving to preserve. So anytime there's a disruption to homeostasis, we respond. That could be our fight or flight response. So hormones will always get, you know, either suppressed or elevated to try and restore homeostasis. However, two hormones that we can influence on a regular basis based on the choices we make, like eating and stress, can create huge effects, or, you know, down the line, sort of downline effects in terms of affecting other hormones. So, you know, if you want to look at it from a mindset, what's the best approach to trying to, you know, stabilize a lot of my hormones? An easy way to look at it, it's not the only way, but an easy way to say, let's try and work with regulating insulin and cortisol. Because think about it, insulin is going to help preserve muscle mass, but it's also going to inhibit fat metabolism, right?
Wow.
So it's good, but it's also bad.
Yeah.
Right. And cortisol the same way. Cortisol is an immunosuppressant, which is good at times. It's also preserving glucose is good, but chronically, cortisol can have detrimental effects on all the other hormones. So gentle undulations of these hormones is normal, but that's something you should be striving for. We shouldn't be striving for massive, you know, over time, massive amounts of one of those two hormones, or, you know, spikes of those hormones. Just like we talk about, we try and avoid insulin spikes or sustained glycemic loads for long periods of time, and that's an easy approach, because that's where you, when I say you, a fitness professional, can help their client in managing their life, their choices and their interventions to try and stabilize those two hormones. And that has a huge impact on helping all the other hormones do their normal jobs.
Fantastic. Okay, now this is a very interesting question. Is it true that women can physiologically recover faster than men during training sessions and between training sessions, and why?
So there's a lot of, you know, reasons for it. There is some truisms. There's some that are just hypotheses, speculated, you know, theories and stuff. But let's talk about some of them. So number one, if we're just talking about in a session, yes. So let's say we're doing anaerobic intervals, right? It is true a woman could actually recover faster between two bouts than a man. And there's a reason for that. Males have more blood volume, right? Generally, the blood volume of a female would be somewhere in the range of about 4 to 5 liters of blood. All right, average male, average female, average male be a little bit more, 5 to 6 liters. So a male has several things that enable him to have more lactate buffer in his blood. He has more type 2 muscle fibers.
Interesting.
Right? So type 2 muscle fibers are anaerobic in nature. So males
They
generally
fatigue quickly. Yeah.
yes, but that also kicks more lactate and hydrogen into the blood.
Okay.
And so males have more blood volume. So by definition, having more blood allows you to have more lactate buffer.
Sure.
Because your blood has to exist in a very narrow pH range, 7.35 to about 7.45.
Okay.
Well, hydrogen ions are acidic or acidifying. Your lactate buffer is a base. You can't just put more base in your blood and have a highly alkaline blood, because you'd probably die, because you denature a lot of the proteins in your blood. So by having more blood, you can hold or accommodate more lactates. I talk about using bowls. I talk about having a little bowl of lactate, which is sodium bicarbonate in your blood. Males have more blood, they have a bigger bowl, which means they can last longer. That's why men can generally go longer in anaerobic work. But now, what is recovery? Recovery is about regenerating or replenishing that bowl of sodium bicarbonate. Well, if you got a bigger bowl, it's going to take you a lot longer to fill it back up.
Yeah.
So that's one reason that women may not be able to work as long as their male counterpart in the work interval, but they actually can recover a little bit more rapidly than the male counterpart. So that's one reason. Let's talk between sessions. So the hormone estrogen. So there's some belief that, we work out, we get muscle damage, and the immune system goes to work, and we get these types of cells called leukocytes, part of our immune response, that infiltrate into the damaged area to help with the repair process. And that creates localized swelling, and it kind of undertakes the process. Now, one thing that we believe, when I say we believe, researchers believe, is that the hormone estrogen can actually help minimize how much of that leukocyte infiltration will happen into that damaged tissue. So you're not going to get as much muscle
inflammation.
Yeah. So theoretically, you're going to recover a little faster. So
wow.
Yes, to answer your question, it appears that women can recover more rapidly between intervals, and they can also tend to recover a little more rapidly between sessions. Now, that's on one caveat.
Okay.
That the two people are doing the exact same workout.
Yeah.
Because if the male is working less intensely than the female, then it's all a moot point, right? But all things considered, you are accurate in making that statement.
Because I also heard like maybe women don't completely deplete their ATP reserve during training. ATP maybe.
I'm not sure. That's it's quite possible, but I'd be honest with you, that's something I wouldn't be able to comment on because I'm not aware of that.
Perfect. Okay, so basically it's more something about the what you just mentioned.
It's the estrogen and muscle inflammation. It minimizes or kind of attenuates the leukocyte infiltration or filtration into the damaged area. So that's between sets, but during the actual between workouts. But during the actual workout, it's the fact that a woman's lactate buffer, the amount she has in the blood, is much smaller, so it can regenerate itself more rapidly.
Amazing. Wow, so interesting. Okay, now does training the aerobic system, this is another interesting question, increase our anaerobic capacity, or is it the other way around? How is it? I'm gonna run a lot, I'm gonna train my aerobic system so I get more, increase my anaerobic threshold, back to the threshold. Or is it the opposite? Is it the other way? I gotta train really intense, really hard, maximum performance in order to get better at my aerobic capacity. Let me hear that.
Interestingly, it's both.
Okay.
So we go back, I mean, not even very far. We go back, even though the research has been out there for a while, but the mindset in the industry, go back as little as 10 to 15 years. There was this idea that they're mutually exclusive. If you train the aerobic system, all you got was aerobic benefits. If you train the anaerobic system, all you got is anaerobic benefits. We've since realized that we were completely wrong in that.
Okay.
They are almost complementing of each other. So I'll give you some examples. We can look at what Tabata. So you remember I had the popularity of Tabata training programs?
Yeah.
I remember his research was done in 1996. He and his colleagues in Japan did this research. And part of their study was they created a protocol. So they had a control group that was doing 5 60-minute steady state, workouts. So it's 300 minutes a week at a pretty high VO2, a percentage of their VO2 max. but it was aerobic. And of course, the experimental group did the idea of the 20, excuse me, I got hiccups. Was doing the 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and they did no more than 8 reps on that, right? And they only did it 4 times a week. So essentially they were comparing 16 minutes of work with about 300 minutes of work, right? And that was the whole point. It was a time, they just demonstrated this time efficiency. But one of the interesting takeaways is what Tabata and his colleagues identified is the VO2 max improvements on both groups were almost comparable. They both showed, I think it was a little under 8% improvement in their VO2 maxes. So it shows that anaerobic, high intensity anaerobic training almost forces the body to try and adapt its aerobic pathways to be able to almost survive that high intensity exercise. It's almost like it's a survival adaptation, where when you put that extreme stress on the body and you're taxing the anaerobic systems, the body's response is, man, I've got to try and adapt my aerobic system so that I can at least try and recover or sustain or do part of the work aerobically. So we have found that high intensity interval type training, and I'm talking about real high intensity interval training, not what the fitness industry generally calls HIIT, can actually, even though it's anaerobic work, can improve your VO2 max or your aerobic efficiency. All right. Now, the other way around is, well, then how does aerobic training improve your anaerobic capacity? Well, one simple way is this. One of the biggest adaptations of aerobic training is an expansion of your blood volume. All right. For a reason. Your body would like to carry more oxygen. How do we do that? If we expand your blood volume, you can then manufacture more red blood cells. It's what athletes do when they cheat, right? Call it doping, call it EPO, whatever you want to call it, right? But this is a natural adaptation that happens, you know, within a few weeks of starting a training program. You start expanding your blood volume. Now, it doesn't raise your blood pressure because you start getting systemic vasodilation. And over time, your blood pressure comes down, but you're actually able to hold more volume of blood so that you can put more red blood cells without changing the viscosity of your blood. Now, think about what an expansion of your blood volume also does. It allows you to expand your lactate buffer.
Wow.
So that's a key thing that a lot of people don't think about. So for a lot of good coaches, what they like to do is to build in the off season a foundation of aerobic efficiency. So they train around VT1, they look for that expansion of blood volume. They try and maximize the capacity of the blood to be able to hold as much lactate for when they move into the anaerobic training. So they have a reciprocal relationship. So in the takeaway here is if you're trying to improve either one of those, both forms of exercise will work, all right? And both forms of both modalities are
will
very
help
good.
each other.
Yeah, so you should actually incorporate some days of more long, slower distance, you know, longer, slower distance type training, LSD training or VT1 training, and then you should have days of interval training. And that's a great balanced approach to cardio training.
Perfect. Yeah, because if you do the same thing over and over, you're going to be very good and have a lot of proficiency on that particular, but maybe not on the other, you know? That's really makes sense all the way. Makes sense all the way. Wow, so interesting. Excellent today with Professor Comana. Thank you so much for taking off of your busy schedule today. And let everybody know where they can find you, send you any questions, anything that people want to ask, where all your contact information.
Well, you can always find me at my email at NASM. So my first, Fabio.Comana at NASM.org is always an easy way to get to me for the NASM Nation. I haven't done it recently because I've been overwhelmed with all sorts of other responsibilities, but I do post periodically. I post articles on Facebook, just, you know, educational articles. You can always reach me through there, but I'll be honest, your best way is to reach me through my NASM account.
Awesome.
And then, of course, I do a lot of content development with NASM.
Wow. Yeah. Amazing. I love those. Definitely I do.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been Sports Medicine.
Thank you, Kaz.